Welcome to Everything Casual, bringing you original football casual videos from the golden era of the 80s and 90s, right up to current day. Football away day stories and historic clashes between football firms. Subscribe so you don't miss out. We upload videos every week.
To understand Ian Tiny Garwood, you first have to understand his football team. Because Tiny's story isn't simply the story of a football hooligan, a terrace hardman, or even a cult hero. It is the story of a man who somehow became all three. For decades, whenever outsiders thought of Millwall, they pictured violence and fighting and an atmosphere that many considered intimidating. The club's name carried baggage. Newspapers portrayed the Den as a place of fear. Television documentaries spoke of hooliganism and racism. Rival supporters often viewed Millwall as football's outcasts. And yet, right in the middle of this environment, stood a giant black man, well over 6 feet tall, who became one of the most respected individuals the club had ever produced. His name was Ian Garwood, but hardly anyone called him Ian. To Millwall lads and rivals, he was simply Tiny. The nickname itself almost seemed ridiculous. There was nothing tiny about him. He was an enormous physical presence, standing well over 6 feet and possessing the kind of build that made people notice him the second he walked into a room. Yet his reputation wasn't built purely on his size. It was built on something far more important: respect. In football culture, particularly in the old days, respect wasn't given. It had to be earned. And according to everyone who knew him, Tiny earned it in abundance. Older Millwall supporters still talk about him with genuine affection. They don't speak about him as a man who wanted fame. They don't portray him as someone who sought newspaper headlines or television appearances. In fact, it was quite the opposite. Tiny was private, family-orientated, straightforward, no nonsense, a man who said what he meant and meant what he said. Yet when he walked into a pub, people smiled. When he entered a room, the atmosphere changed. When trouble erupted, people looked towards him. And when he died in December 2012, after losing his battle with cancer, the club and its supporters honoured him in a way reserved only for genuine legends. As his funeral procession made its way along Zampa Road, players and supporters lined the route in a guard of honour. Think about that for a second. How many football supporters receive such an honour? How many men become so loved that an entire club stops to pay its respects? The answer is very few. Tiny had become something much bigger than simply an old-school football supporter. He had become part of Millwall's identity, part of its mythology, part of its soul. And perhaps what made his story even more remarkable was the era in which it all happened. Because Tiny was supporting Millwall from the late 1960s. Britain was a different place then. Football was a different place. The terraces could be brutal environments. Racism existed throughout society and throughout football. Millwall themselves were developing a reputation that outsiders would later use to stereotype every supporter who ever entered the Den. Yet Tiny walked into that environment and made his mark. He didn't ask for acceptance. He commanded it. He didn't seek respect. He earned it. And according to those who knew him, it didn't matter what colour you were. At Millwall, he was simply Tiny. One supporter who knew him since the mid-1970s put it perfectly. They wouldn't dare say it to his face. It didn't matter what colour you were. It was Tiny. That sentence alone tells you almost everything you need to know about his standing, because in football culture, nicknames can become identities. And Tiny's nickname became bigger than race, background, or social status. He transcended all of it. he became his own institution. By the time younger supporters first encountered him, they weren't seeing a black Millwall fan. They were seeing the Lion of the Den, the big daddy of the ground, the giant figure who looked after younger supporters and protected his own. And perhaps that's another reason why so many people still speak about him with affection. According to numerous accounts, Tiny watched over youngsters attending matches. If trouble kicked off, he would ensure young fans were protected. He kept order. He looked after people. He represented something that often gets forgotten when football hooliganism is discussed. Loyalty, because old firms often operated like extended families. You drank together, travelled together, fought together, and looked after each other. Tiny understood that better than most. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Millwall's terraces were developing into one of the most feared environments in the country. The old den was unlike anywhere else. Visitors hated going there. Rival supporters dreaded the trip. The atmosphere could be electric, intimidating, and chaotic. The club's supporters embraced their outsider status. Millwall against everyone. Nobody likes us. We don't care. That mentality became woven into the club's identity. And within that culture, groups of supporters began forming stronger identities of their own. One of the most notorious was F Troop. To understand Tiny's reputation, you have to understand what F Troop represented. They weren't simply football supporters. They were a brotherhood. Many came from southeast London communities like Bermondsey, Deptford, Walworth, Peckham, and the Old Kent Road. These were tight-knit working-class areas. People knew each other. Families knew each other. Everybody knew who belonged and who didn't. One former member explained that because communities were so close-knit, if someone turned and ran during trouble, they could never show their face again. That sounds harsh today, but it illustrates the mentality. Loyalty was everything. Reputation was everything. And no one wanted to be known as the man who ran. As a result, relatively small numbers of Millwall supporters developed a reputation for taking on much larger firms. 100 men, sometimes 200, against numbers 4 times their size, and still going forward, still attacking, still refusing to take a backward step. That mentality earned them fear and respect in equal measure. And standing among these men was Tiny. Accounts place him among the Camberwell crew. He regularly drank in pubs like the Orange Tree and Rose. He mixed with characters who have since become part of Millwall folklore. These weren't celebrity hooligans. They weren't seeking attention. Many viewed themselves as faceless soldiers of South London. Men who went to football, drank with mates and lived for the tribal experience. And from all available accounts, Tiny fitted naturally into this environment. He was respected, useful in a scrap, dependable and physically imposing. One supporter remembered him as being incredibly proud of his family, particularly his youngest daughter. Another described him as straightforward. No nonsense, no bullshit, always to the point. Others remembered his sense of humour. He'd always make you laugh. When he walked into the room, he'd put a smile on your face. Those memories matter, because they show a different side of men often reduced to newspaper stereotypes. They had families, friends, lives beyond football. And Tiny appears to have been one of those rare individuals who could command respect while remaining approachable and humorous. But football in the 1970s wasn't a world of social media and smartphones. Stories spread through word of mouth, through pubs, through away trips, through reputation. and Millwall's reputation was growing. F Troop became known for ambushes, for aggression, for refusing to back down, for relishing confrontation. Rivals described them as lunatics, self-confessed loonies. Men whose pleasures in life consisted of drinking, socialising, and following Millwall home and away. Anything else that happened along the way was simply part of the adventure. Other firms often spoke about Millwall differently. West Ham's ICF, Tottenham's supporters, Chelsea, Arsenal. Many acknowledged one thing: Millwall enjoyed it. They actually relished confrontation. Outnumbered, didn't matter. Police involvement, didn't matter. Dogs, horses, numbers, weapons. None of it seemed to alter their mentality. And according to numerous accounts, Tiny was right there amongst it. Because by now he had become far more than just another supporter. He had become one of the faces of Millwall, one of its recognised figures, one of its giants, one of its generals. And here's a question for you. How many people can become a legend at a club without ever scoring a goal, without ever pulling on the shirt, without ever managing the team? Very few. Yet, Tiny did exactly that. Because legends aren't always created on the pitch. Sometimes they're created in the stands, in pubs, on away trips, through loyalty, through personality, through simply being there, year after year, decade after decade, through becoming part of the furniture. Tiny supported Millwall for over 40 years. Think about that. Governments changed. Prime ministers came and went. Football changed. The old terraces disappeared. Hooliganism declined. The old den vanished. New generations arrived. Yet, Tiny remained. Still Millwall, still respected, still remembered. And perhaps that is why his story matters. Because in an era where football often feels commercial and sanitised, Ian Tiny Garwood represents something older. Something tribal. Something raw. Something authentic. A man who became a legend not because he wanted fame, but because he lived by the values his community respected. Loyalty, courage, humour, presence, an unwavering devotion to Millwall Football Club. The question now becomes, how did this giant from South London become one of the most revered figures in the history of F Troop? And what exactly did he experience during the wild years when Millwall became one of the most feared names in English football? The late 1960s and early 1970s were a different world. Britain itself was changing. Industry was declining. Unemployment was beginning to rise in many areas, and working class communities often looked inward, relying on their own streets, pubs and football clubs for identity. In southeast London, Millwall was more than simply a football team. For many people, it was a tribe. The areas surrounding the Den were tough places to grow up. Bermondsey, New Cross, Walworth, Peckham, Deptford and the Old Kent Road had their own unwritten rules. People knew one another. Families had lived in the same streets for generations. Loyalty mattered. Reputation mattered. If somebody disrespected your area, your mates, or your football club, there was an expectation that you would stand up and defend it. Into this world came Ian Garwood. Unfortunately, there are still huge gaps in Tiny's early life. Unlike some famous football personalities, he never sat down and wrote an autobiography. He never sought publicity or newspaper interviews. There was no social media, no endless archive of photographs, no documentary crew following him around. In many ways, that mystery has only made him more legendary. Because legends often grow in the spaces where facts are missing. What we do know is that by the late 1960s, Tiny was already attending Millwall matches and was becoming a familiar face around the Den. Just think about that for a second. He was supporting Millwall during one of the most turbulent periods in British football history. This was before all-seater stadiums, before CCTV, before segregation, before banning orders, before police intelligence units. Back then, supporters mixed freely. Away fans could walk into home pubs. Home supporters could wander into away ends. If trouble wanted to find you, it usually could. And it often did. The old den itself was a place unlike anywhere else. Opposition fans regularly described it as intimidating, hostile, and chaotic. There were no comfortable corporate boxes, no tourist sections, no family zones. The den was raw. You could smell the cigarette smoke. You could hear every insult. You could feel the tension. Every goal was celebrated like a battle won. Every defeat felt like a personal insult. Football wasn't simply entertainment. It was identity. And Millwall supporters embraced that identity more fiercely than most. Outsiders often misunderstood this. They saw aggression and assumed there was nothing more to it. But within the Millwall support, there existed something else. Community, a sense of belonging, a feeling that everyone inside those terraces was one of your own. And somehow, despite all the stereotypes attached to Millwall over the years, Tiny became one of the strongest examples of this community spirit. Because when supporters talk about him, they don't talk about his race. They don't describe him as different. They don't treat him as an outsider. They simply talk about Tiny. One of us. One of the boys. One of Millwall. That in itself says something powerful. Because football in Britain during the late 1960s and early 1970s could often be a hostile environment. Racial abuse existed across society. Black footballers suffered horrendous abuse. Black supporters were often a minority at grounds around the country. Yet, here was a towering black man who not only attended Millwall regularly, but became one of the most respected men in one of England's most notorious football mobs. That doesn't fit the stereotype. It complicates it. And perhaps that's exactly why Tiny's story matters. Because history is often messy, it is rarely black and white. The truth is usually far more complicated than newspaper headlines. Supporters who knew Tiny repeatedly speak about one thing: respect. He commanded it naturally. Some people earn respect because they're feared. Others earn it because they're kind. The rarest people earn it because they combine both. From everything that has been said about Tiny, he appears to have been one of those people. He could be intimidating. He could certainly handle himself. But he could also make people laugh. He looked after younger supporters. He took pride in his family. He was straightforward and genuine. He was, in many ways, the sort of man people wanted around them. And that became increasingly important as Millwall's supporter culture evolved. Because by the early 1970s, one name was becoming increasingly well known: F Troop. To younger viewers, it is difficult to explain what firms like F Troop represented. They were not organised gangs in the modern criminal sense. There were no membership cards, no applications, no committee meetings. You earned your place. You turned up. You stood your ground. You proved yourself. And gradually you became accepted. The firm itself was largely made up of men from the local areas: Old Kent Road, Peckham, Walworth, Bermondsey, Deptford, Camberwell. They drank in the same pubs, travelled on the same trains, knew the same families, and because communities were smaller and tighter back then, everyone knew who everyone else was. One former member explained it perfectly. If you ran during trouble, you couldn't hide. You'd be seeing the same people in the same pubs the following week. You couldn't disappear behind social media profiles. Your reputation followed you, that created an unusual mentality. Because if running meant humiliation, standing and fighting became the accepted norm. This, more than anything, explains why relatively small groups of Millwall supporters gained such fearsome reputations. They genuinely believed nobody should ever take a backward step. And according to multiple accounts, Tiny was one of the men at the centre of this culture. As part of the Camberwell crew, he became one of the recognisable faces around Millwall. The orange tree and the rose became regular meeting points. Pubs were football headquarters back then. Plans were made. Stories were told. Arguments happened. Songs were sung. Characters became legends. And Tiny's reputation continued to grow. He became known as the Big Daddy of the ground. Think about what that nickname means. It wasn't the hardest. It wasn't the maddest. It wasn't the leader. It was the big man, a protector, a senior figure, someone people look towards. That suggests something bigger than fighting. It suggests responsibility. Supporters say he looked after younger fans. If trouble started, he would ensure the youngsters were protected. He kept order. He maintained standards. And perhaps that explains why he remained respected for so many decades. Because football firms were full of men capable of fighting. Very few became father figures. Very few became symbols of their club. Tiny somehow managed both. At over 6 feet tall, his appearance alone made him difficult to forget. Imagine being an away supporter in the early 1970s. You've heard rumours about Millwall. You've heard stories about F Troop. You step off the train. You see hundreds of locals gathering. Then among them stands this enormous figure, calm, confident, watching everything. You would remember him, and people did. His reputation spread. Even rival supporters knew who Tiny was. Not because he sought fame, but because his presence was impossible to ignore. Then came the away days, and this was where F Troop truly built their reputation. One former member explained that they could take on firms 4 times their size. 100 men, sometimes less, against several hundred opponents, and they genuinely believed they would win. That mentality sounds unbelievable today, but it was central to Millwall's identity. Numbers didn't matter. Reputation mattered. Commitment mattered. Courage mattered. If everyone stood together, they believed they could beat anyone. And over the years, they developed stories that entered football folklore. Oxford, Blackpool, Norwich, Bristol Rovers, Bristol City, Sheffield Wednesday, Portsmouth, Chelsea. Again and again, Millwall supporters spoke about taking home ends and overwhelming in larger numbers. Whether every story became exaggerated over time is almost irrelevant, because football folklore isn't built solely on facts. It is built on belief. And F Troop believed they could go anywhere. Tiny was part of that generation, a generation that travelled the country following Millwall, a generation that saw football as adventure, a generation that often treated confrontation as inevitable. According to rival firms, Millwall relished it. They welcomed it. They expected it. And perhaps that is why so many opponents feared them. Not because they were the biggest, but because they appeared to enjoy situations others wanted to avoid. The stories became almost mythical. Firms outnumbered 10 to 1. Police horses being targeted. Dog units ignored. Opponents chased through railway stations. Massive confrontations in pubs. Again and again, Millwall's name appeared, and somewhere in the middle of all this stood Ian Tiny Garwood, the giant from Camberwell, the lion of the den, the big daddy of the ground. A black man who had somehow become one of the defining faces of one of English football's most feared firms. But perhaps the most remarkable thing wasn't his reputation, it was his longevity. Because football firms changed. People came and went, some disappeared, some went to prison, some moved away, some lost interest. Yet, Tiny remained year after year, decade after decade, still at Millwall, still respected, still remembered. And soon, the club would enter perhaps the wildest period in its entire history, the era of legendary away trips, the wars with West Ham, the confrontations with Chelsea, the stories of ambushes, pub takeovers, and running battles that would turn F Troop into one of the most feared names in English football. And according to those who knew him, Tiny was right in the thick of it. As the 1970s progressed, Millwall's reputation began to spread far beyond South London. Stories travelled by word of mouth through pubs, train stations and football terraces. Before the days of the internet, reputations were built through whispers. You don't want to go to Millwall. Be careful if their lot are in town. They're absolutely mad. Again and again, rival supporters said similar things, and among those stories, one figure kept appearing. Tiny. By now, Ian Garwood had become one of the familiar faces of F Troop. He wasn't the sort of man who needed to announce himself. He didn't have to shout. He didn't need newspaper interviews. His reputation had been earned the old-fashioned way, by being there, week after week, season after season, home and away, standing with his people, and in football culture, especially during those years, simply turning up counted for everything. Because away days in the 1970s were not what they are today. There were no social media updates telling you where rival firms were. No police escorts for every game. No designated fan zones. No segregation at many grounds. You simply got on a train with your mates and travelled into someone else's territory. And anything could happen. For F Troop, that uncertainty was part of the attraction. According to numerous former members, they loved the adventure, the travelling, the drinking, the banter, the possibility that something could kick off. To them, football wasn't a 90-minute event, it was an entire day, sometimes an entire weekend, a way of life. One former member explained that F Troop wasn't full of hardened gangsters or organised criminals. Most were simply duckers and divers, working class lads, men who bent the rules occasionally, characters, comedians, men who live for football and their mates. That sense of camaraderie is important because when people discuss hooligan firms, they often focus solely on violence and forget the friendships, the lifelong bonds, the loyalty, the shared experiences. Tiny appears to have represented these qualities perfectly. People remembered him as funny, generous, straight to the point, someone who could make a room laugh, yet equally, someone who would never tolerate nonsense. And as F Troop's reputation grew, so did his. One of the most famous things said about the old Millwall firm was that they simply refused to take a backward step. It didn't matter if they numbered 100 against 400. It didn't matter if they were in someone else's city. It didn't matter if police dogs, mounted officers, and rival firms were waiting. They would still go. Again and again. That mentality became almost legendary. Rival firms couldn't understand it. According to numerous accounts from former opponents, Millwall actually seemed to enjoy being outnumbered. There was a stubbornness to them, a refusal to be intimidated. And Tiny was right there in the middle of that culture. At over 6 feet tall, his physical presence alone would have made him memorable. But his reputation appears to have gone beyond size. He was considered useful, reliable, a man who could be depended upon. And in firms like F Troop, that meant everything. Because if trouble erupted, you needed to know who was beside you. Could they stand their ground? Would they run? Would they leave you isolated? Those questions mattered. Reputations were built on the answers. By all accounts, Tiny had already answered them. And then came one of football's oldest and bitterest rivalries. Millwall versus West Ham. Few rivalries in English football have produced so many stories. Few have generated so much hatred, and few have become so deeply woven into local identity. To understand this rivalry, you have to go back to Millwall's origins on the Isle of Dogs. The two clubs had shared history, shared geography, shared working class roots. Over time, football transformed that shared history into rivalry. Then rivalry became hostility, and hostility became something much bigger. By the 1970s, clashes between Millwall and West Ham had already entered folklore. One former F Troop member compared the rivalry to the Crays and the Richardsons, West Ham being the media-friendly East End villains, Millwall being the faceless South London hardmen. Whether that comparison is fair or not is irrelevant. The fact people made it at all shows how supporters viewed themselves. West Ham's ICF often attracted publicity. Millwall generally did not. They preferred operating in the shadows, avoiding media attention, getting on with things. And according to many former Millwall supporters, they even had a nickname for their rivals, the Ice Cream Firm, because, they claimed, they melted away. That insult became part of the folklore. One side telling stories of bravery, the other telling stories of cowardice. Every rivalry does this. Every side writes its own mythology. And Tiny lived right in the middle of it. One famous account describes events surrounding a testimonial for Millwall legend Harry Cripps in May 1972. West Ham crossed the river. Millwall were waiting. What followed, according to participants, was chaos. Street fighting, weapons, running battles. The ICF allegedly retreating into an empty home end. Millwall supporters surrounding them. The match itself almost becoming irrelevant. The fighting continuing for hours. Again, as with all hooligan memoirs, exact details are impossible to verify completely. But one thing is beyond dispute. These clashes happened, and they became legendary among both sets of supporters. Now ask yourself this. Who would have been standing among Millwall's older, established faces at this time? Who had already built a reputation within F Troop? Who was already considered one of the recognisable men around the den? Ian Tiny Garwood, because this wasn't some young supporter turning up years later. Tiny had been there since the late 1960s. He was part of this era. He lived through it. He witnessed it. He helped shape it. And over the years, these stories became part of his legend too. Another story tells of Millwall travelling to Upton Park, a large Millwall contingent arriving and fighting allegedly breaking out across West Ham's own territory. Again, whether every detail has been embellished by time is beside the point, because football culture runs on stories. And the stories all point in the same direction. Millwall had developed an extraordinary reputation, a reputation for going anywhere, a reputation for not backing down, and a reputation that people like Tiny helped create. Perhaps the most telling thing about Tiny's standing is that decades later, supporters still refer to him as the Lion of the Den. Think about that nickname. Lions protect their pride. They defend territory. They lead from the front. The nickname wasn't accidental. It reflected how people saw him, as a protector, as a symbol, as someone who embodied Millwall itself. And perhaps nowhere was that more important than among younger supporters. Numerous accounts say Tiny looked after youngsters, made sure they were all right, watched over them if things became dangerous. This is another side of football culture that outsiders rarely hear about. The older generation often protected the younger generation. There were unwritten rules, standards, expectations, and men like Tiny enforced them. Younger supporters respected him because he had been there, done it, seen everything. When he spoke, people listened. That type of authority can't be bought, it can't be manufactured, it can only be earned over decades, and Tiny earned it. The years rolled on. The 1970s became the early 1980s. F Troop continued building its fearsome reputation. Millwall supporters became known throughout the country. Some opponents dreaded seeing them. Others actively sought them out, because defeating Millwall's firm became a badge of honour. If you could stand up to F Troop, your reputation soared. And perhaps that's another reason why Millwall became so feared. People knew exactly what they were getting. There would be no easy day, no soft touch, no retreat, only confrontation, only resistance, only Millwall. And standing among them all was the giant known as Tiny, the black supporter who had defied stereotypes, the man respected by generations. The figure remembered not only for his physical presence, but for his humour, loyalty, and character. The man who would eventually become one of the most celebrated cult heroes in Millwall history. But if the rivalry with West Ham built Millwall's legend, then the wars with Chelsea, Arsenal, and Tottenham would turn F Troop into something even bigger. They would turn them into football folklore. And according to almost every account that survives, Tiny was right there at the heart of it all. As the 1980s arrived, football hooliganism in England entered what many supporters still call its most infamous era. Crowds were bigger, policing was less sophisticated, segregation was still inconsistent, and reputations mattered more than ever. This was the decade when football firms became household names. Newspapers were obsessed with them. Television crews followed them. Politicians condemned them. Yet within the terraces themselves, reputations became almost like currency. Who had stood their ground? Who had gone looking for trouble? Who had taken a home end? Who had run? Who had won? These stories travelled around the country every weekend. And by now, Millwall's F Troop was spoken about almost everywhere. To some, they were psychopaths. To others, they were legends. To their rivals, they were a firm that simply never seemed to know when they were beaten. And standing among the recognised faces of this era was Ian Tiny Garwood. By this point, Tiny was no longer simply another face in the crowd. He had become one of the old guard, one of the recognised names, a man younger supporters knew on sight, a man whose reputation had already been forged over more than a decade of following Millwall. One former supporter described him as larger than life. That phrase comes up repeatedly when people talk about Tiny. Larger than life, because his reputation wasn't merely about violence or his size. It was about presence. Some people enter a room and everyone notices. Some people walk into a pub and instantly command respect. Tiny appears to have been one of those individuals. And nowhere was reputation more important than during away days. One of the most famous stories from the F Troop years concerns Chelsea. Millwall and Chelsea have never been friendly neighbours. The rivalry between South East London and West London produced some of the fiercest encounters of the era. Both clubs possessed feared firms. Both had reputations to protect, and neither side particularly liked the other. One account tells of 30 Millwall supporters travelling early to Chelsea in February 1977. It wasn't a huge number, just 30. But according to those present, they were some of F Troop's finest. They met at the Charlie Chaplin pub at Elephant and Castle before heading towards King's Road. Now imagine the scene. London in the late 70s, flares, long collared shirts, punk music beginning to dominate youth culture, no smartphones, no social media, just 30 men heading into enemy territory. According to the story, they entered a pub called the Chelsea Drugstore. The barman apparently mistook them for Chelsea supporters. The Millwall men took up position upstairs. Pints were drunk. The atmosphere built. The clock ticked. Everyone waited. Then Chelsea's recognised faces arrived. What happened next became one of the stories that helped define F Troop's reputation. The Chelsea supporters were reportedly invited upstairs. A joke was made about paying an entrance fee. Then, according to the account, chaos erupted. The visitors attacked. Chelsea's men were allegedly thrown back down the stairs. The room erupted with laughter. True, exaggerated, somewhere in between. Nobody can say with certainty after all these years. But what matters is that these are the stories that built Millwall's mythology. And Tiny, according to those who knew him, was one of the prominent members of F Troop during this era, meaning he would have been among the faces helping to build these legends. Stories like this spread, and every story made Millwall's reputation bigger. The following incident is perhaps even more remarkable: the takeover of the shed. For younger viewers, it is difficult to explain how significant this was. Chelsea's shed wasn't just another terrace. It was iconic, one of the most famous football ends in England, a source of immense pride for Chelsea supporters. The idea of another firm's supporters entering it in force was almost unthinkable. Yet according to F Troop accounts, that is exactly what happened. The operation was organised almost like a military exercise, small groups, separate routes, avoiding attention, meeting points, timings. Everyone understanding their role. Again, this illustrates something important. Old football firms were often far more organised than outsiders realised. They weren't random mobs running around without thought. Planning often went into these operations. The aim was surprise. The aim was numbers. The aim was momentum. According to the story, Millwall supporters quietly entered the Chelsea home end and waited. Silence. Tension. Adrenaline. Then came the shout, "Millwall!" And suddenly the place erupted. Fighting broke out throughout the stand. Chelsea were reportedly caught completely by surprise. Some stood and fought. Others retreated. Police rushed in. Batons came out. Chaos followed. Whether every detail happened exactly as remembered is impossible to know. But what cannot be disputed is that these stories became legendary among Millwall supporters. And when supporters remember the great characters of that era, they remember Tiny, because he was there, because he was part of that generation, because he represented everything that generation believed in: loyalty, courage, commitment, an absolute devotion to Millwall. Another thing that separated Tiny from many terrace hardmen was that people actually liked him. That sounds simple, but it's incredibly important. Fear can create respect, but affection creates legends. Again and again, supporters describe him as funny, a comedian, someone who put smiles on faces, someone who enjoyed a drink with friends, someone who had time for people. One woman who knew him from the 70s remembered meeting him years later in the early 1990s. They drank together in pubs around the Old Kent Road. She remembered him as generous, straightforward, no nonsense, proud of his daughter, a family man. That image is fascinating because it stands in stark contrast to the stereotype. The stereotype says football hooligans are one-dimensional, always angry, always violent, always looking for trouble. Yet the people who knew Tiny described something different. A man who could laugh. A man who cared deeply about family. A man who inspired loyalty. A man who had genuine warmth. Perhaps that's why his death in 2012 hit so many supporters hard. Because they weren't simply mourning an old football face. They were mourning a friend, a symbol, part of their own history. But before that day came, there were still many years of football, many away trips, and many stories left to tell. Because by the early 1980s, F Troop's reputation was reaching almost mythical proportions. Other firms spoke about Millwall differently. Even hardened rivals often admitted one thing. Millwall seemed to relish confrontation. One transcript about Tiny includes comments from rival supporters saying the Millwall firm would attack even when heavily outnumbered. Police horses, police dogs, massive numerical disadvantages. None of it appeared to deter them. According to these stories, Millwall simply kept coming, again and again and again. That reputation became central to their identity. It became what separated them from everyone else. One story frequently associated with Tiny's era concerns Tottenham. According to accounts, a small number of Millwall supporters entered an area occupied by around 2,000 Tottenham fans. The national press later called it a terrorist rampage. Whether the numbers have grown with time hardly matters. What matters is that Millwall supporters remembered it as another example of refusing to be intimidated. Tiny and his generation genuinely seemed to believe that numbers meant very little. They valued aggression, momentum, the willingness to attack. That mentality made them feared, and it also made them notorious. The newspapers couldn't get enough of them. Stories of violence sold papers. Stories of Millwall sold even more. The club's name became synonymous with football disorder. And yet, right in the middle of these headlines stood Ian Garwood, the black supporter from Camberwell, the lion of the den, the big daddy of the ground, a man who complicated every stereotype. Because how do you explain his existence? How do you explain a towering black man becoming one of the most respected figures in one of England's most feared football firms during an era when football itself had enormous problems with racism? The answer perhaps lies in something supporters say repeatedly. At Millwall, he wasn't viewed as the black supporter. He was simply Tiny. One of the boys, one of Millwall, one of us. That is his legacy. And as the 1980s moved on, that legacy would only grow. Because some of the biggest battles in F Troop history were still to come. The wars with Arsenal, the continuing feud with West Ham, the stories that would turn Millwall folklore into football mythology. And right at the centre of that mythology stood the giant everyone knew as Tiny. Thank you for taking the time to watch the video. If you enjoy videos about the football casual culture and want to see more, then click like and subscribe. That way you will be notified when we put a new video out and you are playing your part in helping our channel grow. So, thank you. And see you next time.
You hated Millwall. I don't think you spoke to a Millwall fan in over 50 years, is that correct?
I didn't, and then I've got two mates that are Millwall fans now. they're just a little bit younger than me, and they're really nice people. But we never got on. It's the same with them. They say the same, and I had a phone call from a mate of mine who runs, I'm not sure if it's Fairbairn House Boxing or West Ham Boxing Club, and he was in hospital visiting Tiny, who was one of the top people over at Millwall. And he said, I'm in hospital with Tiny, he's got a growth in his neck the size of a grapefruit. He said, and could you have a word with him? And I thought, what do you say to your enemy? You know what I mean? So I got on the phone to him and I said, look, I'm ever so sorry you are like you are. If there's anything I can do to help, I will. We've always been enemies and we always will be, but I've got respect for you and I always know you as Tiny, the Lion of Millwall. And my mate got back to me and said he's in tears. And I thought myself that. And people said to me, why did you say that? Why didn't you say you were a right cunt? I said, no. Well, you can't say that to a man who's dying. You've got to have a bit of respect, you know? And the poor bugger went, you know?